My name is Holger Neubauer. I'm the preacher of the Church of Christ at Lakeshore in South Haven, Michigan. And today I want to continue my study with you, looking into the voice of Zechariah. We've been in Zechariah for a few weeks now. Zechariah contains the most extensive prophecy of the second coming of Christ in the Old Testament, and its message is just chock filled with information about the last days. And so we're kind of slowing down a little bit as we went through Zechariah chapter 9 and now into Zechariah chapter 10. It appears that we probably only will be able to get through chapter 10 and 11. Maybe I'll make some references to chapter 12 and 13 as well as we continue our study. The book of Zechariah is a part of a collage of a picture of a coming kingdom and a coming Messiah. And Zechariah has a unique voice in that he will paint the picture of this messianic kingdom, a new house that's coming, in a different way. And he will clarify some things that really need to be clarified, and we really need to be studying his voice to understand exactly what Jesus would refer to in the Olivet Discourse. So Zechariah speaks about a house that's coming, a house that's going to be built in Zechariah chapter 1 and verse 16. And then in Zechariah chapter 14, we read about the house that is now constructed, this holy house, which of course is the church. It's a picture of the church. And yet it is a picture of a completed church where God would dwell. And in the book of Zechariah, we find that there's a man by the name of Zerubbabel, as we studied a few weeks ago, who is a type of Jesus. Now, Zechariah delivers this message 5 years before the completion of the second temple in 515 BC. So he delivers his message in about 520 BC. But that was only an event which foreshadowed a greater temple and a greater tabernacle yet to be built. And this Zerubbabel, who would lay the cornerstone and also set the capstone, we read about that in Zechariah 4, 6, 7, represents a type of Jesus who would do that very thing. He was going to set a cornerstone and he was going to set a capstone. And we're going to be reading about that cornerstone in Zechariah 10 and verse 4 just a little bit. And of course, Jesus is the cornerstone of his own temple. Well, he's also that capstone. And that capstone will be referred to as Jesus, who is like a jasper stone in Revelation chapter 4, verse 3. And then when we see the New Jerusalem descending out of heaven in Revelation chapter 21, 10 and 11, he, like that jasper stone, would set that capstone of this wonderful new temple that we will see, which is not a picture of heaven. It is a picture of the completed church where God would dwell. And remember from our studies thus far that in 1 Kings chapter 8, it wasn't until the first temple was completed that God would dwell in that temple. That's when his presence filled the temple upon its completion and dedication by Solomon in 1 Kings 8, 10, and 11. That took place at the second temple according to Haggai 2:9. And of course, who's going to argue that the church is not greater than the Old Testament tabernacles and kingdoms? Of course it is. Well, it's the completion of the kingdom, which is the goal of Zechariah, which is the goal of all the Old Testament prophets, which would be consummated at Christ's return, at the fall of the physical temple, when God made it impossible for those Old Testament sacrifices to be observed anymore. God then clarified to the world who the true sons of God were. And of course, they were members of the church. All right. So let's get into the text of Zechariah chapter 10, in which Zechariah is looking forward again to a time of great blessing. It's going to be a time of judgment as well. Now, in Zechariah chapter 10 and verse 1, Zechariah says, "Ask the Lord for rain. In the time of the latter rain, the Lord will make flashing clouds. He will give them showers of rain, grass in the field for every one." And in this language of the prophets, in which blessings are referred to as rain, we notice that Israel itself is an agrarian culture. They live and die whether or not there are rains to prepare the land for the crops. And so the latter rains, the former rains are very important. The former rains are the rains from fall to winter to prepare the land. And then the latter rains, the ones that come in the spring, prepare for the first harvest. And so this is an important part of everyday life for a Hebrew. Well, this is used in a spiritual way. God preparing a new kind of land, a new kind of field. And these former and latter rains will come. The prophet Hosea uses the same kind of language in Hosea chapter 6. And that's the text where Hosea speaks about a resurrection on the third day. I want you to notice here, Hosea chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. The prophet said, "Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us up. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will raise us up." Now, this is the only passage in the Old Testament where there is a resurrection predicted on the third day. In my debate with Bruce Reeves, Bruce denied that Paul was quoting this text in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 4. He said it was from the prophet Jonah, who served as a type, but there's no prophecy there. When I debated Daniel Denham, he said it was a New Testament prophecy that Paul alluded to in 1 Corinthians 15:4, which is ludicrous. Both are wrong. Paul is in Corinth, and that church comes out of the synagogue. And so if you're a Jew, you're not going to be impressed with a miracle per se. You have to have corroboration of the scripture. Deuteronomy 13 and verse 1, we find that the Jews were told through Moses not to follow a man if he offered a sign or a great wonder. So the signs and the wonders of the miracles they have to agree with the law and the prophets. So Paul is making his argument in 1 Corinthians 15 to those with a Jewish background. The false teachers are the Judaizers, no doubt about it. 2 Corinthians 11:22. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. He's talking about those with a Jewish background. So he's arguing to Jews. He has to be arguing from the Old Testament to establish what he believes and what he is saying. And so he quotes from Hosea 6 and verse 2, which demonstrates that Christ himself had overcome Hades through a 3-day resurrection. And then he's going to cite 1 Corinthians 15, 54, and 55. He's going to cite Hosea 13:14. All right, so he's using Hosea as the background. So now notice what he says to what Hosea says. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will raise us up. Christ is the representation of true Israel. Okay, he's the true son. And through that resurrection, the covenant people could be raised with him. And until the covenant people receive their promises, no Gentile can come in. So this is very, very important. Now, he says, let us know, let us pursue the knowledge of the Lord. His goings forth is established as the morning. He will come to us like the rain, like the latter and former rain in the earth. Now notice, Zechariah speaks about this latter, and former rain during this last day period. Hosea says that in the resurrection, knowledge is coming. Now he's going to come like the rain. He's coming like the latter and the former rain. Well, in James chapter 5, James uses this very language to describe the coming of the Lord. And of course, James writes to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. So they have a Hebrew background. Now notice, please, James chapter 5, beginning in verse 7. Therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how that the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Now remember, Hosea connected the latter and the former rain with the resurrection. So the resurrection is the guarantee that God would then complete his promises to the people through the latter and the former and the latter rain, bringing forward the second coming of Christ at the end of the harvest, you see. The resurrection of Christ is tied to his second coming, because his second coming fulfills the purpose of what he began in resurrection. And that salvation process was completed at the return of Christ. He would appear a second time without sin unto salvation. And someone says, well, that's the salvation of our physical bodies. He already saved us spiritually. No. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 9. This is the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Again, 1 Peter 1 9. Your souls would be saved. It's the completion of the salvation work of Christ. That's what it is. Now, James says in James chapter 5 and verse 8, be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand, near, within reach. It's amazing to me how many commentators actually believe this is the coming of the Lord in the destruction of Jerusalem. Albert Barnes believes that. Adam Clark believes that. The pulpit commentary puts Matthew 24:33 with James chapter 5, because now the judge is standing at the door. James 5 verse 9. And Jesus said, when you see these things, know that it is near, even at the door. All right. So Jesus now is standing at the door, and the coming is at hand, within reach. At hand cannot have this elastic view that many take in the phrase. If that were the case, it could have a contradictory meaning. But the words of the Bible, the phrases of the Bible, do not have contradictory meanings. Words can have different nuances of meanings, but not contradictory meanings. Wickedness cannot mean righteousness. Love cannot be hate. Beauty cannot mean vile. And at hand cannot mean afar off. Abraham saw the promises of God afar off, Hebrews 11:13. But here the coming of the Lord is at hand. It was near. It was within reach, you see. He was coming in a very, very little while, Hebrews 10 and verse 37. And we understand the nature of the event by the timing of the event, not the other way around. You don't say, well, that didn't happen, therefore at hand means, thousands of years. That's ridiculous. That's what the premillennialists do. I remember talking to a Mormon missionary some years ago, and I affirmed that the kingdom of God was present. It was here. And he said, well, I don't believe that. He said, when did the wolf ever lay down with the lamb? And I said, well, in Matthew 10, verse 6, I send you as sheep among wolves. So if you had a persecuting party like Saul of Tarsus convert, you would have a wolf laying down with a lamb, wouldn't you? He said, well, that doesn't mean that. And of course it does. It's hyperbole. It's poetry language in which the kingdom of of God is described in these figures because, from God's perspective, if you've got a pure heart that's obeyed the gospel, you've got a peaceful individual who's going to use peaceful means in order to spread the gospel, you see. And so it is a terrible, terrible hermeneutic way to look at the Bible to say, well, that didn't happen, therefore at hand must mean something else. That's crazy. You understand the nature of the event by the timing of the event. That's true in all of the prophets. And Peter and John and the apostles are using the language of the prophets. And so Zechariah speaks about this time of the latter rain. Well, judgment was coming as well during this time. And the Lord would say, my anger is kindled against the shepherds. I will punish the goat herds in verse 3. And so during this time of blessing, there also comes judgment. And yet, from him also comes the cornerstone, verse 4. We know this is the church. From him, the tent peg. This is the establishment of the church, the establishment of the new tabernacle, the tent peg. I want you to listen to Isaiah chapter 33 as Isaiah speaks about this messianic tabernacle that's coming in their last days. He says, look upon Zion, the city of your appointed feasts. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, a quiet home, a tabernacle that will not be taken down. Not one of its stakes will ever be removed. That's a picture of the church. The tabernacle of God that is with men in Revelation 21:3. And the book of Revelation, excuse me, is about the completion of the church. That's what it's about. And here is a picture of that church, that completed church, which God would dwell in it. Now notice what he says in verse 24. I am the inhabitant, and the inhabitant will not say, I am sick. The people who dwell in it will be forgiven their iniquity. In the new tabernacle, they won't be sick. Because sickness and pain and sorrow and tears will be wiped away. And that's not talking about biological realities. It's talking about spiritual realities. God's people wept, as we studied last time in Zechariah chapter 7. They asked, shall we weep in the 5th month as we have done before? No. You won't weep in this next tabernacle because the tears will be wiped away. They were weeping because they were not with God. They were weeping because they were taken off into captivity, because they didn't have their land, they didn't have their temple, they didn't have their law, they didn't have their culture. God has brought them back. He's gathered them together. So there wouldn't have to be the weeping. There wouldn't have to be the sorrow, because we have the presence of our God. And yes, in fact, we are in the new heavens and the new earth of Isaiah 65 and 66 today, in Revelation 21 and Revelation 22. And so you have the cornerstone, the capstone set by Christ, this tent peg that would never be removed. From him comes the battle bow, every ruler together. This is God using his own men. No doubt the apostles have a chief place in this prophecy. They become the battle bow. They become the instrument of God's judgment of delivering the gospel. Do you remember Paul going into a synagogue of Antioch of Pisidia, and he said to that group, there's a wonderful sermon there, chock filled with meaning. You really need to pay attention to it. He says in verse 43, it was necessary that the gospel be first preached to you. But since you reject it and judge yourselves unworthy of everlasting life, lo, we turn to the Gentiles. Who is the instrument of God's battle bow there? Well, the Apostle Paul was, as he was delivering the message of the gospel. They rejected it, so judgment had come to them. And that's the way that judgment was until it increased. And then finally the covenants could change once the gospel went to all over the world. And so I think that's the meaning. And then I'm going to bring them back. I'm going to whistle for them. This is the gathering together of the elect. I think that's what he's speaking about here. Notice here in Zechariah chapter 10, verse 8. I will whistle for them and gather them, for I will redeem them, and they shall be increased as they once increased. So the increase of his kingdom would know no end. Isaiah 9, 6 and 7. This is the gathering together of the elect. A few years ago, I was in a discussion in Indianapolis. John Watson organized the discussion, and a brother by the name of Calvin Schleybaugh, and I studied with him several times. I like Calvin. He's a good guy. We were discussing Matthew chapter 24, and I affirmed that the resurrection took place at the fall of the temple, and the end that Jesus spoke about was the end of their age. And Calvin has a unique view. He believes that the Olivet Discourse is not divided, but it's all about the destruction of Jerusalem, and yet the parables then are talking about something else. But the parables are all eschatological in their nature, and they all describe the time before the fall of the temple as the kingdom is increasing like 3 measures of meal. But that was his view anyways. But he said this. He said, if the resurrection took place by the fall of the temple, it would have been revealed in the Olivet Discourse. But it's not revealed. It would have been here, he said. Well, I believe it is revealed in the Olivet Discourse. I believe the resurrection is found in Matthew chapter 24. Let's read again, verses 30 and 31 of Matthew 24. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Then all of the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He believes this is the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, as do I. Most brothers believe this pertains to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem because it's before the alleged divide of verse 34. I say to you that this generation will not pass away till all these things be fulfilled. All right? Now, he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and he will gather together his elect from the 4 winds from one end of heaven to the other. So if this takes place at the fall of the temple, and he's coming in the clouds with power and great glory in verse 30, and he's gathering together his elect, who are the elect. I think John Watson debated a man who said this was the gathering together of the Gentiles. Are you serious? The elect? No, the elect never means that. We're talking about the saved. All right, the gathering together of the elect. The saved. This is resurrection. Now, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 1, the gathering together and the second coming of Christ are synchronous events. That is, they take place at the same time. Okay? So Paul writes to the Thessalonians. This is one of the earliest letters written. You remember he's expelled from Thessalonica, and then they take a security that he will not return, so he writes these letters back to them. And they are undergoing a Jewish persecution. They're troubled by the Jews. All right? But he writes to them and he says, now, brethren, 2 Thessalonians 2:1, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you. So the gathering together takes place at the coming of the Lord. Well, that's exactly what Matthew chapter 24, 30, and 31 say. He's coming in the clouds with power and great glory. He's going to gather together his elect. This is resurrection. All right? Now, who's going to be destroyed? There's a man sitting in the temple of God claiming that he is God. Well, that's the high priest. Nero was never in the temple of God. This is not the Pope. Who baptized the Pope for the forgiveness of his sins and added him to the church. No, 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 no. The Pope has never been a part of the church. They're a part of some wild denomination that is departed completely from God. No, it's not the Pope. He is talking about the high priest sitting in the temple of God. And he was the one that was orchestrating the Jewish persecution. That's why Paul went to Damascus, receiving letters from the high priest in Acts 9 in verse 1. And this man was against the church. And the Jews troubled the Thessalonians. And he was coming in flaming fire and vengeance upon them. And someone says, well, Jerusalem was a long ways away. Yes, where did the Jewish leaders go for the last Passover feast? They went to Jerusalem, you see. He's going to devour their authorities. And at that, no Jewish authority ever could be mustered again to persecute the church. It was over. And that's exactly what he's saying here in 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 1. So the gathering together of the elect, God says, I'm going to whistle for them. That is synchronous with the coming of the Lord. And that's exactly what he is referring to here in the book of Zechariah. Now, Zechariah speaks about a time where the pride of Assyria will be brought down and the scepter of Egypt shall depart. Right? And he says, I will strengthen them in the Lord. They shall walk up and down in his name. Well, this is the time of the church. Whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. This is by his authority. If any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. That's the idea. Well, how then is it the case that Assyria came under the rod of Christ and also Egypt? Well, if the covenants changed then, which it did, then God would rule over them with the gospel. And so as the gospel then went all over the world, as the covenants changed, Jesus' rule was then established. And that's exactly what Zechariah would say. We'll get to that next week. I don't think we're going to be able to finish our lesson today. But in Zechariah 14, verse 9, he says, and the Lord will be king over all the earth. In that day it shall be the Lord is one and his name one. And this is the day known to the Lord in Zechariah 14, verse 7. And this is the day in Zechariah 14, verse 2, that I will gather all nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, the women ravished, and half of the city shall go into captivity. How can anyone with a straight face say that's not the destruction of the city of Jerusalem? Of course it is. Well, it was a day known to the Lord. In that day, living waters will flow from Jerusalem. That's the time of Revelation chapter 21, when the river of life is seen from Jerusalem, because salvation has finally arrived in its completed sense. That's what he's speaking about, you see. And so here in Zechariah chapter 10, the covenants are changing. And in Revelation 19:15, we find that he's ruling over the nations with this rod of iron at his return. That is a spiritual picture of what changed at the coming of the Lord in the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. Now, let's ask a few questions about the covenant changing. If the covenants changed, they would change in the twinkling of an eye, would they not? If the covenants changed, they would change, the covenants, they would change in the twinkling of an eye. And in fact, that is exactly what took place at the seventh trump or the last trump. Now, Jesus puts the kingdom with the fall of the temple. Luke 21:31. When you see these things come to pass, know the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. That's the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in AD 70. All right? It's not a different kingdom in Revelation 11:15. For the kingdoms of this world became the kingdom of our God. But that was the sounding of the seventh trump. That's the last trump. If there's another trump after the seventh trump, it would be the eighth. And in the Hebrew way of reckoning, that would be the first and not the last. And so then the seventh angel sounded, that's the last trump, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world became the kingdoms of our God and of his Christ. And then he says in verse 19, the temple of God was opened in heaven. Verse 18, the time that the dead should be judged. And this city is where Jesus is crucified in verse 8. And their dead bodies, those are the two witnesses, I believe they're Peter and Paul. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. And they were told at the seventh trump, come up here. Where's here? Heaven. They're resurrected, you see. Peter and Paul get to go to heaven. All right. That took place at the fall of the temple. That is the seventh angel sounding. Now, 1 Corinthians 15 deals with the last trump. The last trump is the seventh trump. The Bible itself is its own best commentator. There are seven trumpets. The seventh trump is the last trump. And the last trump of 1 Corinthians 15 is the seventh trump of the book of Revelation. But the seventh trump of the book of Revelation is all about the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, because when the end came, when the last stone of that temple was dismantled, the resurrection took place and the covenants changed. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 51, behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. Now, Paul included himself with the Corinthians. That is a first century promise. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. Sleep has reference here to physical, biological death, because you would go to a place where you would rest temporarily. Perfect description of Hades, okay? We shall not all sleep. He's including himself. Not all the Corinthians would die before the coming of the Lord, but we shall all be changed. We understand the nature of the event by the timing of the event. It's this change of the covenants. It's not a miraculous change at the end of time. It's a spiritual change at the time of the end. I tell you a mystery. There's only one great mystery. Ephesians 3, 4 through 10 is Jew and Gentile being put into one body. That's the great mystery. Our future as friends have more mysteries than a spy novel. They've got more kingdoms than the Game of Thrones. They've got more ends than Old MacDonald. Here an end, there an end, everywhere an end. More comings than the post office. They got more bodies than a centipede. There's one body. There's one second coming. There's one kingdom. There's one plan that God has to open heaven for his covenant people. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. That's the seventh trump of the book of Revelation. That's what it is. For the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. They came out of the Hadean world into the presence of God. And today, we're all in the same house. You remember when David prayed that he would live in the house of the Lord forever? What do you think happens when we die biologically? You think you're not a member of the church if you're a member of the church now? You think you give up membership? You're always a member of the church, which is the tabernacle, which is the temple, which is the kingdom. My futurist brethren believe that the church is going to come to an end. Are you kidding me? The church is the kingdom. And the kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, so therefore, things equal to the same things are equal to each other. I got an idea that we're going to be with the saints on the first day of the week, in some kind of spiritual sense. God's focus is the salvation of souls. What do you think the focus in heaven is? You get around and watch Gunsmoke in the evening? Is that what you think heaven is about? Or you get stuck singing a note? You know, one note throughout eternity? Futurism has nothing to promote but nonsense. Christianity is about relationship with God in a temple, in a church, in a body, in a kingdom. That's what it's about. And once you're part of the kingdom, if you're with Christ, you can't die. He who lives and believes in me will never die. And I believe we just transition to the other side and we'll see the true realities of what's going on here. And we'll see that there's no need for Jesus to return. There's no miracle in your future. He's not coming again and again and again. No, no, no. There's one second coming. He came, it was a little while in Hebrews 10, verse 37, and he obtained his purposes. So in Zechariah chapter 10, we find that the covenants would change. And then we find, again, Zechariah chapter 11, judgment is coming. And then we find chapters 12, 13, and 14, where the burden of Israel is set forward, that the judgment of the nation as a whole was coming. And Judah and Jerusalem are going to be besieged. The prophetic office is going to come to an end. And Jesus is going to come to return in the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. So I think I'll leave that with you today. And you can leave a message for me if you'd like. You can call me at 269-325-4449. If you have a question, you want to speak respectfully to me, don't mind that. If you're just going to call me names, I'm hanging up on you. Tell you right ahead. I'm going to hang up on you. But if you want to speak respectfully, no problem. Make an argument, I'll talk to you. I'll be reasonable with you. I'll be better with you than you are with me, I promise that. So that's all for today. So I'm Holger Neubauer. Remember Proverbs 4 verse 7. Wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore get wisdom. With all you're getting, get understanding.